Good day, students. Welcome once again to our class today. This is a BJL3108, Public Relations and Diplomacy. And in our class today, we are going to canvass a couple of issues around public relations and diplomacy. And then towards the end of our class, we are going to look at some of the strategies and tactics that public relations officers who are operating within the context of diplomacy can employ in their work. Welcome to today's session. Just to start us off is to give us a kind of context in the world that we are living in today, that we are living in what is called a globalized world, a globalized society. And people like to talk about the world globalization as the world becoming a village, in the sense that nations, different nation states, different countries are operating as though there are no boundaries. There are no physical boundaries or imaginary boundaries at that. And globalization itself has been really propelled or catalyzed by certain forces, such as economic forces, where certain blocks are coming together to do business and to leverage on the block or the organization or the conglomeration of the nations to do business together. So we have certain bodies such as ECOWAS, ESC, and so on and so forth. But also globalization is being precipitated or being catalyzed by things like technological forces, and these are having an impact on global arrangements and communities, where people are taking new identities, people are assuming new positions that are significantly different from their positions remotely. And at the same time, technology is somewhat leading to a dissipation of geographical boundaries and borders. So you have the constraints of distance being reduced by technology, and also the boundaries of time, for instance, time, space, and geography, being defined because of technology. So you could be doing business with people who are located at a different time frame or a time zone, and you could also be located at a different time zone, but you operate within the same medium, but also within the same time span or time zone, irrespective of the space that you are in. So that's the world of globalization that we are living in. And this globalized society, or the new world order, is really speaking or is already pointing towards things like political fatalism of nation states and how nations are presently constituted. The whole idea of citizenship, with certain members of society increasingly viewing themselves as members of a global society rather than members of a specific nation society or nation state. And because of this kind of background, then it's important for us to try and interrogate certain issues that are within the domain of public relations and diplomacy. If you are working within a context that is globalizing, or the one that is already globalized, it is important to look at what role then, or what is the place of PR and diplomacy, not democracy, within this particular context. Historically, it's also important to understand that it is not just these forces that have always shaped how societies relate with one another. And one of the most critical phenomenon in human society that has shaped how one nation relates to another is war. And more often than not, war is viewed as a kind of a policy, as an extension or a continuation of a policy of a certain state. So you think about how Britain, for instance, dominated and colonized many other states across the world, and you think about the means that they used that. If you're looking at war as a form of continuation of policy, you might want to look as Her Majesty's government extending violence to other polities across the globe. And this kind of dominance, or this kind of imperialism that is being exhibited within this context has some very significant markers. So you think about it, and the middle point here to make is that war, or this imperialism, leaves a mark on human life. So you think about what by colonization, what the Britain or what the British people have done to their colonies, say a colony like Kenya. It has left a permanent mark on human life and how human life is organized in a context and shaped society as Kenya. So there are certain cultures, there are certain ways of doing things. There's a way of looking at life that our society has been clearly shaped by the British and by the fact that they colonized this particular context. So to understand this kind of imperialism, or what you're calling global order and war, it's important to look at the historical antecedent to how nations have always related with one nation, for us to make sense of the idea of information flow, public relations within the context of a globalizing society. So if we are presently here in an era of technological revolution, what is being called as electronic colonialism, which is the present kind of global order, and I'll speak to it. It has not always been like that, If you track a global order all the way to the era of military colonialism, and at this time the Roman Empire was expanding in parts of Europe and in parts of North Africa, conquering states, conquering polities, and assimilating people into Christian beliefs and Roman Catholic religion at that point. This led to an era of Christian colonialism, and Christian colonialism was promoted a lot in Middle East and parts of Africa, and this led to dominance of certain cultures, ways of life being put into, or being subjected into, the peripheries, and the culture and the way of life of the domineering people, the people who are conquering, being promoted within those contexts. So you look at communities like Africa and Middle East who did not previously have Christian ways of living or Christian ways of belief, now adopting a new way of faith, and that in itself is what scholars look at as Christian colonialism. So there's a lot of literature that is looking at how Christianity as a form of colonialism has been or has spread over time in different nation states. Then at the 17th century and coming all the way to the 20th century, then with the rise of industrial revolution and urbanizing societies, we came up with, or scholars have come up with, what is called mercantile colonialism, that looks into the idea of one nation rising over another nation to take the toil and soil of a particular nation to grow industries or to grow cities and to have capital to do business. And if you look at then how the British, how what you call a scramble for Africa, for instance, the nations that were involved in scramble for Africa were involved in mercantile colonialism, in the sense that they would invade other communities and they would take the people as a way of getting labor, but also their resources to enhance their capital and to grow their industries. And because of this kind of global order, the world itself has become disproportionately arranged, in the sense that now we talk about what is being called a global south and a global north. And a global south is the countries that are being seen as coming from the peripheries, countries that are being called third world countries or developing countries. And the global north are what is being seen as the developing world or developed world for that case, or what you call the first class world or the first world in different contexts. So if you are looking at this in terms of information flow, and you go back to the idea of electronic colonialism and you start to ask yourself certain issues in how information is flowing from one side of the globe to another side of the globe, if information is a wave, in what way are people then becoming electronically colonized? So you think about the devices that we are using, how information is flowing within these devices, what is the movement that scholars have found that information does not flow in an equitable manner, and therefore there is a kind of disparity that exists, and there is what you call information haves and information have-nots, meaning that if you look at because of the existing kind of imperial trends that have been there, whether it is mercantile, Christian, or military, that has laid background for certain political, socio-economic facets of poorer countries to still continue being dominated by the countries that are being called the haves. And it's not just the information that has traveled from the center to the periphery, that is the haves to the have-nots. Also culture, ways of doing things, business, language, and so on and so forth have also been communicated or have also been imparted into the periphery nations. So you find people who are not English speaking, like Kenya, for instance, where English is not our first language, but we speak English with a lot of proficiency. We write English with very good levels of understanding of someone else's language, and so on and so forth. So this is what is being called vertical flow of information. And vertical flow of information is when information is coming from the haves to the have-nots, in the sense that there is no equity or kind of an horizontal flow, and vertical flow of information has always favored rich nations. So how cultures are passed on to other nations, or ways of doing business, and so on and so forth. And in 1979, because of this realization, then the UN body that is tasked with education, science, culture, the UNESCO, United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, set up a commission that was called the McBrine Commission, to investigate this kind of inequality and to look into a call for what is now called the new information order, where communication will be democratized among the nation states of the world, or the polities that make the global order. And the McBride itself had a rationale that for this to happen, then there is need to have participation in media management. So if you are a PR practitioner, it's important to have this background as you practice PR within an international PR context, to understand management as a form of participation, where voices are included, or voices that have already been excluded into the discourse are brought into the context. Then also the idea of counter-information, where local media movements and radical oppositions can start to rally against the existing wave, or to rally against the dominant ideology that has primarily been perpetuated by the vertical flow of information, by encouraging horizontal communications and freedom of the press. So the McBride Commission itself has came up with certain resolutions, and these resolutions have been, among others, to eliminate imbalance within nation states and how information flows, and also to eliminate concentration and privatization of what is called the IMM, that is international mass media. So you look at channels like BBC, CNN, and the dominant mass media platforms that are coming from colonizers such as Britain, or France 24, DW coming from Germany, and so on and so forth. The McBride Commission called for elimination of these forms of concentration and requested for privatization. And also to remove obstacles and challenges that have to do with the free flow of information and ideas, such that there is an horizontal or an equitable flow of the said information and ideas, as well as plurality of sources and channels of information within different societies, and freedom of the press and freedom of information, and the people who actually trade in this information, who are called journalists. Among others, also included to develop mass media of developing nations, or the so-called periphery nations, to have their independent voices, to have their independent channels of speaking to the rest of the world in a developing context, so that can guarantee that their cultural identity is respected and not drowned or overshadowed by the colonial mentality and tendency of the first world. And also the idea of equity again, that people need to participate equally in information exchange, and that rights of groups should have to have access to information sources and participate in the communication process. But these Commission's proposals have been very idealistic, in the sense that they were very good on paper, they were very good in passing them, but ideally they were opposed by the first world. And some of the countries of the first world that have opposed this include countries like Britain, countries like the US, which have been dominating for a very long time in this vertical kind of information. And this has led us now to the idea of diplomacy, not democracy. And diplomacy has been seen as a way of having structured communication between states, that it's less expensive, it's less messy, and it's conducted by institutions that are beyond the states themselves, such as bodies as the European Union, the African Union, and regional bodies of the UN, such as UNESCO and so on and so forth. So within the context of international PR and looking at diplomacy, scholars have tried to investigate then what is it that we discuss when we are looking at the concept of diplomacy. And diplomacy has been seen as a way of, or a structured communication, like I've already said. Structured in the sense that there is laid down protocols of doing things, how actors who are involved in the communication, the channels that are involved in the communication, and so on and so forth, they all form a structure. And other scholars such as Baston have defined diplomacy as being concerned with management of relations between states and other actors. And this is important because it is concerned with advising, shaping, and implementing what is called public, not public, but foreign policy. But importantly to note is that diplomacy always revolves around the idea of dialogue, that, you know, it is communication, it is dialogue that is institutionalized in the sense that, you know, it is agencies, it is governments that are speaking to each other through recognition. So there is a term here that is very important, recognition. And I'll also speak to the idea of double recognition, that you have recognized representatives at an international level who are playing in with other internationally recognized entities to achieve, to produce, to manage, and distribute public goods. So the idea of recognition is a very important concept that needs to be understood within the concept of public relations and diplomacy, because recognition means that even if someone comes from a country that is in structured communication from with another country, for instance, currently Kenya and Somalia seem to have a tiff, or to be having a kind of a storm, that a diplomatic storm. Not just anybody from Somali can talk to Kenyan government, and not just anybody from the Kenyan side can talk in Somalia. There is the idea of double recognition, that there are certain people, and those are the only people who can do structured communications at a diplomatic level. So you have people like ambassadors, foreign affairs ministries, diplomats, you know, members of the diplomatic corps, who are appointed by parents or by their mother countries to represent those countries in this structured communication. And the idea of producing public goods, not just producing them, but also managing and distributing these public goods that include things like security, things like trade, things like development, environmental protection, things like health, migration and control of people, and also good governance. So this is what has led to a concept that is understood as public diplomacy. You know, if you are in the context of producing and distributing these public goods, then there is need to understand the idea about public diplomacy. And there is an historical antecedent again to the concept of public diplomacy, that if you interrogate the idea of double recognition did not apply prior to World War. And thereafter, there changes were brought into how nations would relate to one another, that one nation would not, prior to the World War and what was called the Havana Convention of 1928, The convention itself codified the idea that nations would not be allowed to either interfere with internal affairs of the ambassadors or the host state, and also they would confine themselves to official channels of communication. But after the World War II, diplomacy between states has changed significantly, and now there is the idea that people or members of the diplomatic corps who are coming from certain representative and well-recognized bodies can now start to influence public attitudes and how foreign policies are being formed, setting the agenda for discussion or setting the agenda for this structured communication. So there are certain parameters that are being discussed here for public diplomacy to be operationalized, and one is the fact that it is transparent and widely disseminated. So if you think about things like the U.S. policy and how the U.S. policy has been, the U.S. foreign policy on let's say something like terrorism or something like how the U.S. engages different states and so on and so forth. When you're thinking about public diplomacy, you're looking at, you know, those non-structured channels that the U.S. has applied to reach directly to members of public of different states that they've engaged. So you look at things like movies, you look at how the mass media has been used to shape opinions around foreign policy and so on and so forth. Then it is transmitted by governments to wider and also in some cases select groups, and it's concerned with attitudes and behaviors of the public and how they, so it's about perceptions and how they view the concept of one state and another one. So as a public relations officer, let's say you are working for a certain organization that cuts across different nations, that have different cultures, that have different political ideologies and so on and so forth. It is important to have this kind of background on how then the international public relations would wade into the area of diplomacy. And there is a quote I've provided here that you know, kind of puts things in context, that there aren't many differences between cultures, but those differences make all the difference in the world. When you think about the fact that where I started this presentation on the idea of a globalizing culture or a globalizing society and world, there is a movement towards homogeneity. But there's a lot of differences between that homogeneity, but because of the few differences in the nature of homogeneity, those differences make the difference in the world. And therefore, as IPR practitioners or PR practitioners within the context of international level, it's important therefore to provide and produce public relations that would not just position the publics, the organizations and nations to the publics that you're concerned with, but also sustain a kind of confidence within those publics in how the image and the reputation you're trying to carve. So when you're thinking about publics and you are discussing the idea of publics within this context, you look at some literature that is suggesting who are the people who form these publics, and these publics are formed by bodies like what you call international organizations. So you think about the UN, you think about World Bank, you think about IMF. These form what you call international organizations, the form of public. So people are concerned with making policy at the World Bank that will touch on an organization or a community that you are involved in providing public relations for. Then we also have intergovernmental relations. Intergovernmental relations have to do with things like diplomatic recognition, alliance formation and disintegration, and also things like sanctions and embargoes. And this can fall under the example of Somalia and Kenya that I've just previously highlighted, that now that intergovernmental relation has entered into almost diplomatic non-recognition. And in fact, I think last month we did have the envoy from Somalia leaving Nairobi and now severing ties, diplomatic ties with Kenya. Alliance formation and disintegration again can also apply at economic levels, which is also what I'm talking about down there under transnational economic transactions. And you think about blocks and multinational corporations doing business at a global scale and signing certain pacts that either make doing business easier, such as voiding certain border controls or certain taxes and so on and so forth, or certain expectations of goods that are coming from one area to another. Then interaction among citizens can also form a kind of area that public relations and diplomacy could be involved in. And you think about things like film, art, music, sports, and so on and so forth. And you look at the example of something like UEFA Champions League, or the English league that has been going on for quite a while, and how that has shaped the image or the perception of Britain in the global scale. So, and how people do interact with something like football, how people coming from different contexts that are remotely connected to Manchester United or Liverpool and so on and so forth have certain attitudes and behavior and affiliation to these sports organizations or sports clubs that you would think that they actually are members of the Britain culture. So when you are interacting with PR within this context, you want to ensure that the organization that you are having is receiving a kind of winning support within the community of nations or within the publics that you are actually interested in either persuading or cultivating or positioning whatever organization it is within those publics or within a particular public. Then you also want to look at sustained loyalty, not just sustained, but you also win the loyalty. You look at good citizenship and respect for government and leadership of independent nations as a way of fostering those structured communications in diplomacy. Then you build patriotism among citizens in a country and also those in diaspora, and some of activities that many governments, such as the Kenyan government, does either through sports such as rugby, activities such as the Kenya Tourism Board activities. They are meant to encourage the idea of citizenship, not just locally but also in the diaspora. So people who are living in the UK or people who are living in the US can feel a sense of belonging within the Kenyan context or within whatever context it is that they come from. And also you deal with disinformation, misinformation, and so on and so forth under the broad category of propaganda against either the government that you represent or also against the institution that you are representing at an international level. And deal with that notion I started with that is called vertical flow of information, and encourage two-way flow of information between one nation and another, probably then achieve the goals of the New World Information and Communication Order, NewCo, and also sustain and achieve media understanding and cooperation amongst public. So what are some of the strategies then that we can use to achieve the goals of public relations within this context. So that will be the last thing that I talk about today. So one of the strategies that that a PR practitioner in this context can employ is a strategy on cultural centers. You establish cultural centers in different contexts. So think about cultural centers like the Chinese Confucius Institute that is being set up in different countries. So you come to Kenya and you go to different universities, you find that the Chinese have set up a Confucius Institute in a place like Kenyatta University or the University of Nairobi, for instance. What these centers are promoting is an idea of selling the culture of other people, selling the language of other people, selling the ways of life of other people, how they cook, how they prepare their meals and stuff like that, how they dress, the music they listen to, and so on and so forth, through the establishment of these cultural centers. And if you are representing, let's say, a government, or you're working as a PR officer at an international level, then cultural centers can become one of the most critical areas that can lead to changing of attitudes, changing of mindsets and perception towards the organization that you represent. Then something else, if is you are within the international economic playground, so you look at things like international trade fairs, international trade shows, and so on and so forth. So you bring and showcase and position the goods and the services that your organization is either selling at an international level. So something else is also you can organize seminars at a local level or at an international level, and you know, during these seminars you can educate people on the goods and the products, or basically your client, among others. Then you can hold press conferences periodically. You know, you can call the international mass media to give them press conferences regarding the activities of your organization or your government or agency, so that they can also portray the body at an international mass media audiences. Then also have conference centers. Think about the African Union, and the African Union being, you know, like a magnet of different countries in the continent of Africa. If you utilize an opportunity like having, you know, the meetings, the annual meetings of these people, then you can also sell your organization or your government in an international perspective. Effective media relations, you know, a very critical or a critical area on how public relations officers deal with whatever channels of media are within the context of their operation, whether it is radio, TV, newspapers, and now internet and emerging platforms. If you employ this effectively, then you reach the constituents of the publics that you are interested in reaching out to. Sponsorship of sports activities, and for this one I would give the example of something like Sports Pesa, and other betting agencies that are coming from outside Kenya and coming into Kenya and sponsoring things like football clubs, you know, different sports activities that are within a country. So what this is doing is that you are entering into the people's psyche, you are entering into the people's consciousness, you know, by supporting things that are emotive to them, things that are you know, you are influencing their attitudes and their perception towards the product or the service that you're offering, which is also the same as literary works. When you think about films, music, and works of literature or creativity, plays and so on and so forth, when you have this presented in a way that influences their attitudes or the attitudes of the publics that you're involved. And then finally is advertising. And advertising in the international media, you employ advertising strategies that incorporate not just the business strategy, but also strategy at a macro level and in terms of relationships between the country or the countries that you are dealing in. So these are some of the strategies, programs, and tactics that you can employ when you are dealing with the context of PR and diplomacy, you know, this idea of structured communication at an international level. This is where we come to the end of our lesson today on public relations and diplomacy. Thank you for listening, and I will see you at a different class. Thank you.